Just want to shift focus a little bit now to web development and application development. We've now looked at sort of how the user uses computers. How is it that we create the web and applications to make sure that they work with these type of technologies? The definitive standard is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, the way these came about is that the World Wide Web Consortium was founded in 1992 by Tim Berners-Lee. And at that time, as you can appreciate, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but how do you literally translate the graphical web into 1,000 words? And that was a conundrum that the early W3C really wrestled with. They addressed this in 1999 by coming up with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 1.0. And these guidelines became spread all around the world. There were 65 checkpoints spread across 3 different priority levels. Those priority levels basically said priority 1 means you absolutely have to do this, and that's within the ABC guidelines too. Priority 2 means these are other things that you really should do, and priority 3 was these are things you should do if you're building a site, pretty much specifically for people with disabilities. Now, although WCAG 1.0 was a big hit, and even now is still quite well used in Australia, ultimately it became rapidly outdated. It was very specifically focused to coding techniques of the 90s, which some 10 years on are a little bit outdated now. So in 2001, the W3C could see that this was happening and thought it was time to start to create some new guidelines, being WCAG 2.0. They wanted to shift the focus, instead of being code specific, given that was becoming outdated with new technologies, they wanted to move towards a direction where, rather than looking at code, look at can people with disabilities actually achieve on a website what they want to achieve. However, there was a little bit of controversy along the way. There was a very famous posting by a blogger named Joe Clark. He wrote a very famous article called "To Hell with WCAG 2.0," and in that article he made the point that to have a several hundred-page, easy-to-use manual and lots of guidelines and lots of technologies, it was becoming a bit complicated and a bit of a backward step. But in a famous counter-argument to hell with Joe Clark, Martin Klein wrote an article saying basically we have to go forward. There is a strong need to embrace new technologies. The guidelines are in many ways simplified, even if there's more explanation behind them, and ultimately we need to go with the flow. So that brings us to WCAG 2.0 that after 7 long years was finally released in December last year. Now, although WCAG 1.0 is still the standard in Australia, in government and media circles, including the ABC, to be honest, the rest of the world has moved on. The US, Canada, the EU, and so on have all embraced WCAG 2.0, and that HSBC legal case I was telling you about earlier is based and hinged around WCAG 2.0 compliance. So I would say that there's a very strong argument then that we need to catch up to the rest of the world and shift our focus as well on trying to meet the user experience. WCAG 2.0 basically looks at 4 what they call the PAW design principles, and that PAW stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable is basically the same as adjustable. So can I change the colours, the fonts, the way this site's laid out to make it accessible to me? Operable is more about finding what you want, more of a usability aspect. So can I get to where I want? Are things logically the way that I expect them to be laid out on the site? Understandable is more about content. Can I actually understand what's written on this site? Is it aimed at the level of writing that I would expect for this information? Like if I'm looking at a medical website, is it medical? If I'm looking at a fairly basic site, is it written for that audience in mind? And robust basically means, will this site still work in 5 years as technologies evolve, or will it crash with my particular assistive technology product? So just to go through the guidelines, there are, instead of 65 checkpoints, there are only 12 in WCAG 2.0. But yes, there is a 300-page manual hiding underneath that. Fortunately, you don't have to read that back to back. It's more a reference guide for people implementing particular types of technology. So the 12 is really the key points. First up, provide text alternatives. And this is still the same as WCAG 1.0, really, really important. For those who aren't familiar with text alternatives, what that means is that if you have an image on a website, there should be a little description about what that picture says. So if it's a picture of a dog running down the street, there should be a little bit of text saying dog running down the street embedded in the code. That means that if I'm having a voice program read things out to me, it can read out what that picture is about. Also, you need to provide captions, and this is certainly a really important thing, especially given the amount of content around at the moment. The BBC iPlayer now has captions and audio description for pretty much all its videos online. I haven't seen too much of that at the ABC, and so that's something worth considering. There's also a need to make content adaptable and to make sure it works with assistive technologies. So when a screen reader is used or magnifying zoom, make sure that the site can be usable in that context. Use sufficient contrast. Sure, you know, people might like light blue on hot pink, but if you don't, the reason might be because it's very difficult to read. So it's worth considering high contrast. I don't want to cramp people's design tastes and styles, but readability is really important, especially in a media organisation. Operable. Basically, make sure that everything is accessible by keyboard. A really easy way to test this, just press the tab key. And if the tab key can take you to all the links on the page, then that's pretty close to being keyboard accessible. Give users enough time to do things. And this is something which the ABC does really well. I haven't found anything on the ABC that puts pressure on you to try to finish things in a particular period of time. Probably that example I was giving earlier about buying tickets for Cockatoo Island, the time issue was a big issue in terms of access. Do not use content that causes seizures, so don't have lots of whiz flashing type content that can distract people. And just make sure that content can be easily navigated. In terms of understandable, make sure the text is readable and understandable. Make sure the content appears and operates in predictable ways. So intuitiveness is very important. Also help make sure that users can correct mistakes. One of the sites that I find challenging sometimes are grocery sites, where you'll be buying things online and you selected the wrong item, then it's really hard to unselect that wrong item. So make sure that if people do fall in the hole, that they have the ability to climb back out of it again. And robust, just make sure that when you do fire up assistive technology products, or as said in 5 years' time, that the site's not going to crash because of things which have emerged. So that's a little bit of web side of things. Now to look a little bit at the application side of things. For those of you who create applications, the W3C also has ATAG, which is the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. There's basically two parts to this. The first part deals with if you are creating a tool which people will use to create things, if that makes sense. And then the second part is more what most people use, and that is just if you're writing applications. A good example of part A is if you're creating a cloud computing application, so you're developing something which people will then in turn make a document or something like that. Part A looks very familiar to WCAG 2.0. And I should also stress that this is the draft standard. This is yet to be officially ratified by the W3C, but ATAG 1.0 is quite out of date now. Basically, the authoring tool must make sure that it meets accessibility guideline, and then when people are creating tools, so let's say Visual Studio, the Microsoft main programming suite, within that you should be able to edit documents in a perceivable, operable, and understandable way. Part B of ATAG is more what most people will look at. And there are basically three major points to ATAG. And I've just summarised them at the bottom. Basically, first, turn on the features of accessibility. If you're using Dreamweaver, there's a tick box in the Dreamweaver settings that means that you'll get constantly pestered about accessibility things. Visual Studio has the same. Many other Adobe products have the same. Just make sure that in the application that you're using to create software, that you've turned on the accessibility features, which if they complied with Part A, should be present. Secondly, use them. If Adobe does pester you for accessibility things, do what it says. Incorporate that into your program, and at the end of the day, you'll have a fairly accessible application. And thirdly, make sure that people know that your program does comply with accessibility guidelines. People with disabilities will, because of the nature of those statistics, people with disabilities will choose your products, your code, your important work, if they know it's going to work. Ultimately, people with disabilities want to see the hard work that you've put into things in the ABC, and following that is a great way to share it with them.